Okay, we're going to get started. Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee. We're here today for City Council Resolution 22-0125R, occupancy permits, inspection, and code enforcement for the purpose of requesting that representatives from the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Baltimore City Fire Department, and other interested parties appear before the council to discuss the process of conducting building inspections and code enforcement prior to the issuance of an occupancy permit for a property in Baltimore City, problems that may occur during the process in connection with an unabated vacant building. I'm Eric Costello, councilman from the 11th District, chair of the committee. I'm joined to my left by Councilman Robert Stokes, 12th District, vice chair of the committee, Council Vice President Sharon Green Middleton, 6th District, member of the committee, Councilman Chris Burnett, 8th District, member of the committee, Councilwoman Odette Ramos, 14th District. To my right, Councilman John Bullock, 9th District, and we will also be, we are joined now by Councilwoman Danny McCray, 2nd District, member of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To my immediate right, Marguerite Curran, staff to the committee. We have Autumn Grant from Mayor's Office on behalf of Mayor Brandon Scott. And I know we have folks on virtually representing Council President Nick Mosby. With that, I will turn it over to the sponsor of the bill, Councilman Chris Burnett from the 8th District for brief introductory remarks. Before I do that, for everyone who's testifying, the first time that you testify today, just trying to get in the habit of this as we get closer to budget hearings, if you could say your name and your position title and which agency you're with. We know all of you folks, but again, I'm just trying to get in the habit of that in committee. Councilman Burnett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues, agency reps for joining us today. So I'll keep my remarks quick. This bill, I believe I put this in last August or so, last summer. So a little bit of a long time coming on this one, but at the time, my office, and I would imagine probably my colleague in the 6th as well, were receiving a lot of calls from people in Northwest Baltimore about use and occupancy permits. As you all are probably aware, on the DHCD side, in the Howard Park and West Arlington and sort of that corridor along Liberty Heights Avenue, there's a tremendous amount of acquisition and redevelopment happening, and has been so for a few years now. I've had a constituent call it Investors Row. And you know, obviously happy to see the revitalization of formerly vacant properties, which I think is a good thing. But we were receiving a lot of calls from people who were purchasing homes unknowingly that had vacant building notices attached and did not have use and occupancy permits. Information wasn't disclosed to realtors, and they were later finding out due to the passage of a bill that we passed previously through the council requiring signage to be posted on vacant properties. And so one constituent in particular that came home was really embarrassed, had a guest with her, saw the sign on her door that her house was vacant, and it's a fully furnished place that she'd been living in for a few months. And so she was obviously highly upset about it. We tried to help her as much as we could, but ultimately the inspection still needed to occur. It wasn't her fault, it wasn't the city's fault. It just had not, the person that she purchased from did not disclose that information. And so it created a lot of hardship, as you all know, and I'm sure the agency will discuss like what a UNO entails. In this instance, it would have likely meant that, you know, they would have to go through drywall to access electrical lines and other infrastructure. And with a newly constructed home, just didn't sit well. And so we put this resolution in and are finally working on a hearing on this to discuss not only this situation, but I think just a good time to have a primer on UNOs and what the agency is doing to work with the real estate industry to prevent this. I think things have cooled down a little bit in the housing market, so I haven't gotten as many calls about this recently, but I still thought it was an important discussion to have. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Chair Costello. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Let's start off with, we've also been joined by Councilman Ryan Dorsey, 3rd District, member of the committee. Let's start off with the Law Department.
Good morning, Chair. Jeff Hochstetler from the Baltimore City Law Department. The Law Department stands by its report and approves this resolution for form and legal sufficiency.
Thank you, sir. Baltimore City Fire Department, no objection. You can take off your mask when you're testifying. if
Okay,
you'd like.
good afternoon, sir. Deputy Chief Derek Reddy, I'm the fire marshal. We have no objections.
Thank you. And Department of Housing and Community Development.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Stephanie Murdoch, the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm joined here today by Deputy Commissioner Hessler. We are pleased to participate in this informational hearing about not only the process of obtaining a use and occupancy permit, but also some of the challenges that some individuals are experiencing in Baltimore. I just wanted to give a little background before we get into the meat of the issue. In calendar year 2022, DHCD processed over 40,000 permits, and we worked diligently across agencies to move these permits in a timely manner. During that same period of time, we received and processed over 5,000 use and occupancy permits, applications, and issued over 3,000 use permits. I will say that the length of time between application and final approval depends greatly on the nature of the permit. There are several steps in the permitting process, including application review, processing, approval, and payment. And as we discussed in recent hearings, DHCD operates under a hub and spoke model, whereby oftentimes referrals are made to other agencies. Right now, applicants can apply online or in person. During the COVID pandemic, we did shift all of our permit applications to be handled online, and that can be done through the e-permit system. The applicant would create a new application containing certain property and owner information, a detailed description of the current and proposed use of the property, as well as supporting materials. And correspondence about that permit application can be made through the built-in message board. For those folks that still prefer to come in person, we have our one-stop shop permit center, which reopened to the public April 16th, 2021. So customers that prefer to do so can still come and work with our office service staff at 417 East Fayette Street. They can let the applicant know what their permit is going to require and help answer any questions. Some of the challenges that were mentioned by the sponsor earlier that have come to light, particularly with the posting that's taking place, is the fact that occasionally individuals will purchase a rehab property that had not obtained their use and occupancy permit. We worked with Councilmember Ramos in 2021 on the required real estate disclosures bill. So I think that was a great step in helping to address this problem, but it is ongoing, and it is oftentimes extremely time-consuming and can be very expensive for the new property owner. So we have been working on a one-on-one basis to complete consultations with new owners that unknowingly purchase a rehabilitated property that is subject to an open building notice. And we are currently working with the law department on a set of rules and regulations that will make it easier for victimized purchasers of these properties to obtain their UNO. So we stand by our bill report, and we are happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. We've been joined by Councilman Isaac Itzy Schleifer, 5th District member of the committee. I'm going to go to Councilman Stokes and then Councilman Burnett.
I just have a question. How many actual, on your permits, you have staff that handle the commercial part and the residential, or they handle all that together? So my question is, you say you have 40,000 requests for permits. How many employees you have? 8? So you got 8 employees, am I right? How many?
Jason Hessler, Baltimore City Department of Housing, Deputy Commissioner. There are 18 employees between the permits office and the plans review office that work on reviewing permits. There's 8 positions within the permit tech, which would be the individuals that process the permits applications from start to finish. They don't necessarily review every piece of it, but
So you have 8 employees who handle permits. Wow, you'll never catch up. You have 40 requests for permits, and you have 8 employees. Is that something that, Mr. Chair, This should be coming up in the budget hearing. You got 8 employees, you'll never catch up. We're gonna always have a problem with permits. If we got 40 requests for permits and we got 8 employees that's handling that, that's virtually impossible.
The processing of the permits and the work that those 8 staff do, they are not behind. There's not a backlog there. When I looked this morning, they had under 50 things in their buckets. Now, they'll get several hundred throughout the day and process those. What that staff does, though, is really just process what's been put through. Where you see delays in permits is when there's the need for additional reviews, because our permits come in, as Ms. Murdoch spoke, you know, it's a hub and spoke model. So there are some permits that require reviews, multiple reviews within multiple agencies. Some go to the fire department, some go to the Department of Planning, Health Department, Department of Transportation, Department of Public Works. And as the jobs get bigger, the reviews get more intense.
And real quick, I just think that if you got 8 employees, wherever the permits go to, you'll never, that's why we get calls about somebody applied for a permit and they waiting for a phone call, they send an email and no response, and then probably, my colleagues could probably agree to this. As soon as we reach over there in the email, they're like, oh, here go the permit, let me send it to you. And if you only got 8 employees that's covering 40 permits, that's gonna always be a problem. And I'm only bringing that up because they need to look at hiring some more people to handle those permits. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We're going to go to... Okay, technical difficulties. We're going to go to Councilman Burnett, then after that, Vice President Middleton, Councilwoman Ramos, and then Councilman Schleifer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we just, I guess, start with the inspection itself? What does it entail? So we just sort of have a level setting of like what, because you mentioned that the process can be lengthy and expensive. Can you just walk through like what it entails to get from a vacant building notice through the inspection process and to a home that's now able to be sold?
Sure. It depends on the property, which I kind of hate saying, but vacant building notice is issued on a property because the property is unoccupied and an inspector has found that in some way it is unsafe or unfit. Now, it could be that a tenant was living there or a homeowner was living there and the property got boarded to secure it, and that prevented adequate light and ventilation. Those boards come off and the property could be up to code and perfect. So when I say it kind of depends, it depends on the situation of the property. But I think for the argument here, or the discussion here, if we're talking like a gut rehab, the person that is rehabbing that building should be pulling permits to do that gut work. They should have permits for all of their electrical, their mechanical, their plumbing, their framing, and all the construction that goes into it. And there are various inspections on each of those trade permits and on the construction permit that they're responsible to call in. And just to get to Councilman Stokes' point, they don't actually, when I say call in, they don't actually have to physically call in and speak with anyone for these inspections. They can either log into their account and schedule it online, and about 80% of the people that schedule inspections do it that way. Or they can use what's called an IVR, where they can call in and there's a series of numbers they punch in and put in their permit number, put in the type of inspection, and then it automatically schedules their inspection. Currently, today, for our building and electrical inspections, you can schedule, if you called in this morning, you could have an inspection tomorrow. We're next day with those. Our mechanical inspections are a little bit further behind, but that's just kind of the difficulty there within that realm and staffing. But it's on the person that's doing the work at the property, whether it's the electrician calling in for the electrical inspections or the GC calling in for the framing or the insulation, for them to call and schedule those inspections. Our inspectors come out, they review the work, If it's approved, they mark that in the system. If it fails, they also document that in the system with notes as to why it failed. If it passes, they leave them an inspection tag with the person that shows that it passed, so they have a receipt, so to speak. But really, we go off what's in the system, so each inspection goes through, and you should be getting your inspections in order so that you're not putting drywall up before you've seen the electrical behind the wall or the plumbing. And then at the end of the process, you would apply for your use and occupancy permit. For a residential vacant house, the fire department is not involved in those inspections. They are involved in other use permit inspections in relation to commercial properties or larger occupancy loads, large MFD properties and things like that. But for a residential single-family vacant house, it's just going to be housing, building inspections that is out there. We will confirm that all of the prior inspection, all the other permits are signed off. They've passed all those before we leave the office to go out and do that final inspection. And then we'll walk through the house and make sure that everything is there. Smoke detectors are up, the railings are in, the hot water works, the electric's on, any of those items. And some use and occupancy permits fail, and there's generally smaller items that need to be corrected. But for the most part, when you get to that stage of the process, you've already had a number of inspections and you're ready to pass your use and occupancy. And once the building inspector comes back and signs off in the system that it's been approved, the vacant building notice automatically gets canceled or abated. And that resolves the issue. Where we see problems in this process is when people either don't apply for permits or they don't call in for their inspections. And this can happen for the whole project, or it could happen in bits and pieces. So you may have the electrician that's coming in early on the job, he pulls a permit and he calls for all his inspections. And the plumber pulls a permit and calls for all their inspections. But then the GC falls off and doesn't call for the insulation inspection or the framing inspection. They just close up the job, finish it out, and sell the property. When those occasions occur, it's actually a better scenario than most, because we've got final inspections on everything that's behind the walls. The only thing that needs to be checked is really the insulation, which you don't necessarily have to rip the walls open to do that. And so we can go in with the new homeowner in those situations and kind of do that final use and occupancy inspection without requiring new trades, new electrical, new plumbing, or any of that. There are situations that we've come across where there are no electrical or plumbing inspections, but we can tell that electrical and plumbing work has been done. Or there are permits for that stuff, but then no final inspections. And those are the cases that have become more difficult when we're working with constituents that buy these houses thinking that they're brand new, renovated, everything's great with them, and then they get a vacant building notice sent out to them, or they get the sign posted on their door or something of that nature that lets them know that they actually bought a vacant building. And in those cases, we will usually assign those to a supervisor to kind of handhold a little bit the property owner, because in most of those cases, that property owner bought a brand new house that somebody else rehabbed because they didn't want to be in the business of rehabbing a house. And it is a business, and it should be operated as a business. And so we do work with those owners. Some of their biggest challenges that we are aware of is when the electrical and the plumbing work either doesn't have permits or doesn't have the inspections, and they now need to get, and those permits have expired. And so now they have to get a new electrical or a new plumbing inspection permit, which means they need to get a new electrician on board, or the former electrician that worked on the job back on board, and it ends up being very expensive for them to find somebody that's willing to put their name on somebody else's work, or to come back in and try and figure out what work was done and make whatever corrections are needed. So that's one of the biggest challenges in those cases where the seller has failed to complete the trade work in the beginning.
So, quick follow-up on that. What information is provided to home buyers at closing about this? And secondly, for contractors, is it a part of like the licensing process that they also become familiar with the required permitting process as well? Like, is it possible that like, I guess I just leave it there. Are contractors, is that a part of any sort of curriculum that they should know sort of what this process should entail?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for particularly licensed master electricians and plumbers, they're aware of the permitting process. I mean, they're professionals and this is their business. For contractors, it's, I would say, probably hit or miss. There are some that are professionals in the business and get their permits and know what they're doing, and then there's others that are more fly-by-night and cut corners and aren't necessarily carrying any licenses or any insurance, and they refer themselves as contractors, but they're not necessarily what I would refer to as a professional contractor in the trade. And they don't, not having any license requirements, I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't know that they need permits for most of what they're doing, but you certainly come across that. As far as what information is relayed at the sale of the property, I've always been of the opinion that work done without a permit on the property, if the seller knows that there was work done on the property without permits, particularly if the property has a violation notice on it and a vacant building notice, those are all things that should be disclosed by the seller at the table. And this council, particularly in reference to vacant buildings, passed Council Bill 210078 that specifically states that in a sales contract, you must put in writing that there is a vacant building notice on this property. That got passed a little bit over a year ago, I guess. So that definitely clarifies it for the sellers, that must be in there, and hopefully real estate agents are putting that in their contracts here in Baltimore City. But even before that, I think that there was a duty by the seller, the seller's agent, even the title company, when they're doing their research, to identify all this information. And it always floors me because I will have some title companies that contact our office and they're being super diligent, and they see the vacant building notice, and we know that the buyer knows about the vacant building notice. Like the person that's buying the property is a developer. They have intentions of tearing this building down and building a skyrise or something. And we'll have a title company that is just super vigilant and wants our office to abate the notice or get rid of it or explain it out. And we're like, look, it's a vacant building notice. It travels with the property. The buyer's aware of it. That's all that's necessary. And then you'll have other situations where you get the house fully rehabbed, but it still has a notice on it, and the title company never blinks. And the property transfers, and of course, as a buyer, you're just waiting to get those keys and get in your house and unpack. You're not going through the inches of papers when you're signing and paying attention to every piece of paper. And so you don't know to ask whether or not all the notices have been abated on the property or if there is a use and occupancy permit. I think most people in the public that are just buying a house don't know what a use and occupancy permit is. And that's one of the reasons why we've always canceled the vacant building notice whenever we identify a transfer and reissue it, because we know whether you're moving into it as it's a brand new house or you're moving into it with plans to gut it and rehab it, you've just bought a vacant house that's subject to a vacant building, and you've just gone through 2 or 3 inches of paper in signing that. So you might not remember what that vacant building notice said, a couple weeks after signing. And so When our inspectors are triggered by the system that there's been a transfer of property, we go in, we cancel the old vacant building notice, we mail out a new one. And that's just to get that back in front of the property owner at a time when there's not a stack of other paper in front of them, and they can then read it and be like, oh, I'm required to register this property because I'm not living in it and it's vacant. I need to keep it clean. I need to keep it secure. I need to get a use and occupancy permit before I move in. And all that is in the notice, and that's our reasoning for sending it back out once title changes. When there are delays in recording, that causes problems because we're not flagged that there's a change in ownership, so then the inspector's not flagged to cancel and reissue, and so there's sometimes delays there. But we do try to get that information out to the new owner so that they can address it if it hasn't already been addressed.
Thank you. Council Vice President Middleton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Councilman Burnett, for putting in this bill. It's a very important subject, and you're right. Northwest Baltimore has a lot of people are redeveloping homes and selling, and it's a lot of big homes, like in the Forest Park area that we share, and Windsor Hills, and we have periodic situations in the Ashburton community and so on. So my first, I guess one thing, I think it would be if we could help in a way to disseminate information in our communities, if some type of flyer could be developed with some really key points, that would be very helpful. We all do newsletters or different ways that we do things, and this might be a nice message to put out. And the other thing, I guess, back to job opportunities and requirements of a person that's doing inspections, and I know code enforcement is involved. You talked about different people that do. What are some of the requirements of a person that you hire to be to inspect in the permit process and so on? Do they have to go through an apprenticeship?
So for the permit side, no. I mean, it's city employment. It is I believe they have to take a test and get on the list, but. For on the inspection side within the building and trade inspection side, for building inspectors, we're looking for experience in the building arena, having either worked as a contractor. Some people go to school and do get certificates or degrees in relation to contracting. Our inspectors under the electrical, plumbing, mechanical stuff, they actually have to be licensed. It's state requirement that they carry a master's license, which makes it very difficult to find applicants that are interested in walking away from, in many cases, their own business, where they're, a master electrician and they're overseeing journeymen and apprentices and running a business, to stepping away from that and coming to work for the city. So we see a lot of individuals that are looking for a second career. They're ready to pass on their business maybe to a mentor or to a family member that has come up through the ranks, and they're looking for something a little bit less stressful, but still has good benefits and pay, and they're not ready to sit back on the backyard and sip lemonade all day. They still want to work, but not quite as hard as they were working when they were overseeing a team of electricians or plumbers or something like that.
So how does the fire department relate to that as far as inspection? And do you have those requirements, or is it a different piece of inspection?
In order to inspect in the fire department, you have to actually, we have two systems. We have a civilian system, and then we have the sworn personnel. all of the inspectors in the fire department and fire marshal's office are sworn members of the Baltimore City Fire Department. They come in as a firefighter or paramedic. They are required to be certified, minimum, a certified fire inspector 1 through Maryland Fire Rescue Institute, which is board certified, nationally certified. Then they take a test, and then they come in on a ranked system, go from 1 through 10, and we hire them off the list, or they promote from either firefighter or paramedic or whatever position. Now, on the civilian side, we have a permits technician and we have a office assistant, and right now we are in a process now of trying to create a civilian position for plans review to help us out in our plans review system.
Okay. And I know that the fire department has, you do things in the high schools to, you know, promote, you have a connection with the high school to promote
Yes.
firefighters. Is that this type of job included? Just trying to
Well,
that employment.
on the high school program, what they do is they go out into the high schools and they push the career for a firefighter. And then those individuals that come in through the high school system, they come in as firefighters. For instance, when I taught at Walbrook High School, fire science, we did have individuals come in from the Walbrook program into the fire department, and then they work their way up through the ranks once they get in.
Okay. Is that program still?
No, that program's, I think currently now it's in Dunbar, Patterson, it's 1 or 2 other schools, if I'm correct.
Okay. And then lastly, your connection with CHAPS, that's important too. I just, one little situation in the Ashburton community where a house was built and so on, and it was completed. And they sold it, and the people that bought that house, you know, at first they were left with paying the fine, you know, the fines of $1,000 a week or something, and we kind of see little situations like that. That's where there's a lapse in communication, but I know that CHAPS had been working to try to correct that so that things like that don't happen again.
Right. We do work closely with CHAP. The system actually is parcel-based, so every parcel is assigned different codes, and CHAP is a code within the system. So if somebody applies to do a exterior renovation of some sort on a property, and that property is in a CHAP area, the system flags it, and then that's one of the referrals on that permit. It gets sent to the CHAP reviewer to then look closer at those plans and make sure it aligns with the plan for Ashburton or whatever area it's in. Same thing applies to if the property's in a floodplain or if it's in an urban renewal plan. So that's where permit applications that come in end up getting sent out to various areas depending on where the property is located and what requirements follow in that parcel, as well as what type of work is going on. So it is a bit of a complicated system that luckily, unfortunately, works very well in flagging the properties to make sure it gets to the right people. Where you go into trouble is when people do things without permits, you know, so they don't apply for the permits. You know, whether it's intentional or unintentional, they don't apply for the permits, and then it either becomes a problem for them or it becomes a problem for whoever they pass the property on to, because that work is still there, it was still done without a permit, and so it's an ongoing violation that needs to be corrected when we catch up to it.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I just want to suggest again, if you can develop a flyer or something to send to the committee that we can kind of look at, I think that would help us. And if you could kind of consider, you know, we're going through a big changeover in jobs and looking for people, and these are, if you could periodically do certain things in high schools to bring awareness to our high school students that, you know, there's jobs out here that you can kind of, if you're interested in that field, can focus on.
I didn't mention this, but on the housing inspection side, which is under Chief Booker, we do have an apprentice program. So we do look for high school students or high school graduates or other individuals that want to come in and be a housing inspector, or property maintenance inspector, which is a little bit different than the building inspector job. But they do get trained up and then can work from that apprentice position into a full housing inspection position. But they come in with benefits and a salary and then can move up the chain. So we do have that intro position for individuals.
That's a good program, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things. One is, you know, we did have a hearing a few weeks ago in, you know, ECD about the permit process, and I know that we're going to have another one to follow up with the reforms of the department. So I'm looking forward to that. Obviously, there's been, I believe that there are people who don't get permits for houses because it is very difficult to work with the permit office. And so that has been something that our ECD committee is focused on. Madam Chair, you've talked about that. So I think it's important to just realize that we have to make those reforms in order to make it easier for people to actually follow the rules. So the other piece is we passed, so we will have subsequent hearings about that issue. Madam Chair has agreed to do that. And then, you know, last 2021, we passed the bill that I sponsored. Thank you to my colleagues for voting for it, so that the buyer or the seller had to disclose that there was a vacant building notice on the property. My question to DHCD is that I thought that DHCD was going to do some training with the realtors and the title companies to make sure that they knew, because we had an agreement with GBBR already to include that disclosure into the Maryland contracts. So can you tell me a little bit more about how that has worked out? Because it's obvious that there's some slip somewhere if people are still buying, you know, properties with VBNs on it that they didn't know.
We have not had that training yet, but it is still on the agenda to.
This is a year and a half later after we passed the bill. So we haven't done it with GBBR or the title companies yet?
We have not had that training yet.
When's that happening?
I can reach out to them and see when we can schedule that.
Who's responsible for that?
I will be.
You're the one responsible for making sure that there's the training? Because, I mean, I'm happy to help reach out to whomever. My worry is that, you know, there are very few title companies, I mean, I'm just going to say it, that are worth their salt. And so, you know, they're often going to push a sale rather than getting the lien sheets, because also we have a delay in lien sheet processing. So when we have a delay in lien sheet processing, we also want the title companies and the realtors are pushing sales, and people end up getting, you know, we passed a law with good intentions, but we need to have it, you know, implemented, and so I'm happy to work with you on trying to get this done, because, you know, we're gonna hit another, you know, I think positive trend in the market where people are gonna buy, and I'm confident in it, and so we're gonna have to make that happen, because you know, and GBBR also agreed to make it happen. So the second question was, since I remember the discussion during the passage of the bill that said that we have, if this happens to a consumer, that they can't bring legal recourse. Remember, we had this whole discussion about it. However, because the GBBR put the disclosure in our Maryland contracts, I believe that now residents can file suit against the previous owner if this happens. Do you know how? I don't think anybody's filed a suit against the previous owner on this. I'm
not aware of any, but I don't remember that exact discussion, because, I mean, I would be of the opinion that anyone, whether it's before the passage of the city council bill or after, potentially may have a civil claim against parties that are involved. They have the ability to file a complaint with the Attorney General's Office, Consumer Affairs Division. And depending on the facts of how that property was advertised and sold, may have a claim there. So, and I think now with the passage of that city council bill, they may actually have a complaint to the real estate board.
They definitely have a
that's not
complaint to the real
filed.
estate board,
So
yeah.
There's, I think, 3 different options for property owners that are victimized in this way.
Do we have a sense of if there's a trend in terms of the previous owners of these properties? Like, are we seeing the same people doing this?
There are a couple, I can think of at least one frequent flyer that we've identified that we're looking into. But I've got a list of about 30 properties that this has happened to, maybe 33, that we've identified in various means that we're trying to work with those owners or have worked with those owners. But there may be other trends in there. Sometimes it's difficult to sort out with the different LLCs and stuff, exactly who's who and who's doing what.
Yeah,
but,
for sure, yeah.
we do look for that.
Okay, and then the other piece is the lien sheet issue in terms of the delays in lien sheet processing. I think that's a finance department issue. But I do think that my understanding is that it used to be 2-3 weeks, and now it's like 6 months. There's been a real problem with lien sheet. I guess that's a finance question because they're the ones who do it. But that's a huge delay issue as well. So I hope that we can get to the bottom of this. The last question, Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman, I want to try and keep it at 2, if that's, unless this is directly related to the previous one.
It's quick follow-up.
Okay, but moving forward, we're going to stick to 2.
appreciate
We're going to
it.
come back around, so there'll be, I just want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate it. So one of the other conversations around the bill that we passed was that there are times when people sell homes that do not have contracts. And so we know that some of those transactions happen. Do we think that this phenomenon around selling folks homes that don't have VBNs is around the fact that they are not using proper contracts?
Repeat that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about a couple of years ago is that there are times where somebody will just sell somebody a home without using a proper contract or the Maryland contract. They might just pull something off the internet and,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think, okay, so it's more, they're not usually necessarily a real estate agent, so they're not,
Correct,
going
correct.
through the standard forms. That does occur. I don't know that I don't know how it measures up against how many of those homes are vacant versus rehabbed and still vacant. I've never matched up the deeds that get recorded and to see if it looks drafted by an attorney or not, so I'm not
Okay, so I
sure.
guess that's something we have to look into.
Yeah, I'm not sure
Okay.
about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Councilman Schleifer? And then we have Councilwoman McCray next.
I don't even know where to start, to be honest with you. But first off, the 3 of you up there, Chief, Jason, Stephanie, you guys have been very responsive, so I appreciate that. I'm sorry I have to call you guys 30, 40 times a day, especially Jason. I don't give you any breaks, so I appreciate your responsiveness. There's a whole variety of issues, right? But I think the one thing I want to zero in on is we know how difficult it is to get through this process, right? We know there's constantly issues on the city side. I assume you guys worked out the payment issue last week where people couldn't pay for their permits. That's resolved. So the one thing that I'm noticing a lot and I'm hearing more routinely is that there's a lot of things that people have to get permits for that they really shouldn't have to get permits for. A lot of like basic stuff. I'm putting aside any life safety things, all life safety things. I agree there needs to be some checks and balances, but there's a lot of things that are overreaching, a lot of things that also are preventing people from investing in these properties in the city. We know we as a city need people to invest private dollars in the city and in their properties, and the permitting process should be a protection, not a hindrance towards those projects happening. And so my first question is, are there items within the permitting process right now that you guys would be willing to take off the table with legislation that say you no longer need permits for the following, like we did, for instance, with the sheds? Is there other things that off the bat you're willing to let go of peacefully?
Off the top of my head, there's nothing that comes to mind, but like we did with the sheds, happy to work with you or any members of the council to identify, if there's something, look into it. We took the shed thing seriously. We went to the fire department, we went to our engineers in the plans review division, and then came up with what we thought was reasonable. So we're open to those discussions, but I don't have a list of things necessarily.
So if we're sticking with just the stuff that's currently on the books, are you guys at least willing to roll back some of these requirements that people have to produce? Like, we're asking homeowners to get site plans and other drawings that cost thousands of dollars that these folks don't have. And so on small projects, we're not talking about big commercial developments, big commercial properties. We're talking about site plans that you're requiring of people. I have one to address with you after this hearing. Over a landscaping thing, you guys are asking for site plans that an engineer is telling me is going to cost $50,000 to produce for somebody to grade their property. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things that are basic things that need to get done that can't get done because the process is just too strict. And so, and there's also just not enough help on the backside to get those answers about how that works, which is why a lot of that ends up coming to our office, or people just opt to not get a permit, which is happening more and more frequently because of these problems. So are there items that you guys are able to ease the restrictions, especially as it relates to these expensive site plans that are necessary for a more back-of-the-napkin, drawing, for instance?
Yeah, so not being able to speak specifically to that issue because I'm not aware of it, where site plans are required, it's usually a good reason for those site plans. We live, in most cases, right on top of each other, and we have a lot of requirements within the city code, the zoning code, the international building code. There's a lot of different requirements where we wouldn't be able to properly review a project without a site plan and understanding exactly where something is supposed to be built, how close it's going to be to a neighbor's house, how close it's going to be to a property line, whether or not it's going to be in a floodplain, or whether it's going to be in the front or the back of the house. So where site plans are required, I would say they're needed, and it's not necessarily DHCD that's requiring those site plans. It may be the review by the planning department. You mentioned something about landscaping, so that might be something that they're requiring in relation to the landscape design or forestry project or something of that nature. Public Works, you mentioned grading, so that's going to be Public Works with soil erosion, depending on how much of the property is being disturbed. And being in the permits and litigation section, I'm in an interesting crossroads of seeing things where You know, on one hand, I can have a property owner that's complaining because there's too much being asked of them in a permit or the need to get a permit. And then on the other hand, I've got a neighbor or a community that's, you know, complaining that we're not doing enough to make sure that that neighbor is building something correctly, or, you know, so we get it on both sides, and we do try to strike that balance. I'm always open to having the discussions if there's a particular area where you think we could adjust. We did do that a year or two ago with fences on 1 and 2 family residential dwellings. We made some adjustments there, so we can, where we can be flexible, we'll be flexible. I feel like there was a part 1 to that I missed.
I didn't hear the last thing you said.
I feel like there was a second part to your question that I can't recall.
No, I mean, it's just that there's a lot of examples that we can go, and I'm not talking about when someone's building an addition or they're adding on, like where they're doing a large scale project. What I'm talking about is the more basic projects that people are working on to improve their property, ones that are not, you know, aren't going to affect their property lines or anything. I'm talking about the basic stuff, right? If somebody wants to regrade their property, right? Why is there like a requirement to have these professional plans created, which make the project just not feasible at all, because people can't afford $50,000 when they're working on a landscape project like that. And so when you're doing something like that, you're not covering it with concrete where you have stormwater issues, but then you get into like the disturbance issue. Well, if you're grading your property, that's to absorb the water. You're going to plant grass, you're going to do that kind of stuff. So what can we do to, what should our next steps be in order to get past this hurdle that our constituents are facing every day? Should we be proposing new positions within your office of people who can help with site plans for minor projects? Should we be proposing a permit review commission that takes a sledgehammer to the entire guidebook that you operate off of every day? I mean, what do you think the best next steps for us is to make things easier for people to invest their own money in their property?
So, a couple things that we are doing that are in process to address all those issues. We are in the process, as Councilwoman Ramos had mentioned, we are in the process of revamping the permitting system. So we've been working very closely at BCIT, partner agencies. We sent out a consumer survey to over 20,000 customers about 6 or 8 weeks ago and got those comments back. We've held focus groups with developers, community members, just different groups to get feedback like you're providing on the permitting system. And we're using all that. We are looking to get software that is the industry standard, something that's off the shelf that we can modify slightly to our needs, but really comes off the shelf and is built with the customer in mind, so that the process is a lot easier for people to get through without needing to call or email or message, that they'll be able to kind of get in there, identify immediately what documents they may need to have ahead of time, what those documents look like, have that stuff ready as they're applying, and be able to apply and process. Currently, we process the vast majority of permits immediately, like within a couple hours, a day or two. Out of over 40,000 permits, the vast majority of those go out pretty much immediately without additional drawings or any other needs. But there are permits that require those things. We are getting ready to post a permit liaison position. This would be a position, someone to work with consumers, and particularly those working on more complex projects, but then also like individual houses, like if just somebody trying to do an individual rehab and needs that extra guidance. So it would be a navigator type position, someone that could work with them to make sure that they know where to go, how to go, if they're running into problems with soil erosion, that they could, help with that, or if they're running into problems with the fire department. Another person to take those calls and guide people. And then we have a meeting with the comptroller's office. We're exploring some work with the phone systems to lift that burden off of the permit staff that are processing permits and be able to better take in calls, respond to calls, and have set times for responses back. So we have a meeting later this week, maybe tomorrow, with the comptroller's office to talk about what technology is available already in-house within the city before we explore if we need to get something outside the city.
So a few things on what you just said. So I guess we'll start from the ending. As far as the phone system, I think the big issue with the permitting office phone system is that people have to pick up the phone and then put it to their ear to talk to the customer. And so any new phone system isn't gonna really help if people aren't answering the phones, and those phones ring off the hook all day long. But putting that aside for a second, a bigger issue at play, which you just mentioned, it's the first I'm hearing of this. So you're looking for a new interface, like a new website system that's being used. Didn't we just spend like 7 years building out this e-permitting system out of the housing department? I mean, I remember when I just got into office, I met with, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name now, if you say it, it will come to me. I met with him a whole bunch of times about different issues within the permitting system leading up to e-permits, which was eventually launched, I think, what was it, 2017, 2018, 2016, whatever it was. That person built out a whole system. Are you now saying we're scrapping that entire system and looking for a new platform altogether?
Our permitting system's at least 15 years old. It was branded as e-permits probably in like 2011, maybe, I think it was. But the system itself, the backbone, is over 15 years old. It was all built in-house. And so with our current alignment and working with BCIT, we're not in a position where we can continue to support this system. So we've been working, and we've talked about it at other hearings. We've been working not just to replace the permitting system and the plans review system, but the inspections piece and our enforcement piece. So all of that will be, and is in the position of being replaced.
When was the e-permits launched?
I'd have to go back and.
It wasn't 15 years ago, the e-permits as we know it today.
It's the same system, it just has expanded over time, and it was rebranded, but our permitting system that e-permits sits under is 15 years old. The e-permits piece was that it went online, and you could apply for a majority of the permits at that time when we went online. At that point, it was probably like 70%. You can now apply for 100% of the permits online. So the interface of being able to apply online versus come into the office is what happened when it launched as e-permits, but it was still the same permitting system that we were building off of. We used to get 1,500 to 2,000 customers a day in the permits office, physically coming in. And when we switched over to e-permits, that's reduced down to where we usually have about 20 customers a day coming into the permits office. But we still have people that message us through the message board and call, and those those 8 staff members that are supposed to be processing the permits, they're the ones that also answer the message board and also answer the calls. And so if they're answering one call, they can't pick up the phone to answer a second call. It rolls over to a different person. And that's, so when I said that we were looking for phone system, we're not looking for a physical phone system, we're looking for technology that would serve as a call center. to be able to answer those calls, redirect them as necessary, answer the questions that we can answer without having to pull that permit tech off of processing permits. And then be able to assign specific times when that permit tech or one of the permit techs could return calls that need to be returned.
And so when do you anticipate identifying that new technology that you plan to use as our new permitting system?
We've been in the process of working with BCITO on that. My hope is that we have a contract before the end of the fiscal year.
Okay. And will every single function, every single agency operate within that system? Whereas right now, some of DPW's in one frame, you guys are in a different frame. Is every single person across the city, everything going to go through this one permitting system?
For all of the DHCD permits that get processed and all of the partner agencies that work and review those permits, they will all use that system as they currently use the e-permit system. There are other licensing and permitting applications that exist in the city that are not currently part of what DHCD does, and those at this time won't be included. So, the soil erosion plans, review and permits, those are going to still be in DPW's system.
Why can't that move over? Because if you have a plan, if you're doing a development or you're doing a project at your house, and you need, that's one of the steps in the process. And so if they're in a different system, you're looking at your guarantee dates in your permitting system, but then, we're being held up by DPW, which is in a completely different system. Why wouldn't they move over into the same system that you'd be selecting?
The reviews for permits that you apply through our system would still apply, and so those would still be in place, but expanding out to every type of permit that the city issues is a much larger project, and that's not what we're looking to do at this point.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilwoman McCray?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first, I have just a few quick questions about staffing. The first one is a follow-up to Councilman Stokes' question. You mentioned how many positions you have processing the permits. How many vacancies, if any, do you have?
There is one unfilled position and one I signed a letter last week to hire somebody. So that position's being filled. I guess they start in 2 weeks. And then one position that's not filled.
Okay. And the permit liaison position, what's the timeline for you guys to fill that position?
Hopefully in the next 2 to 3 months, once it gets through the process of advertising it and interviewing and getting the people on board.
2 to 3 months.
Yes.
Okay. So I have one more quick question. Per the code, we know that if a violation is not promptly discontinued or abated, or if the violation notice or order is not complied with promptly, then legal proceedings may be instituted. So my question is, annually, how many cases does the legal section receive regarding violations with unabated vacant buildings?
Just a point of clarification, in relation to the bill here where it's a rehab property that is transferred over, or
That is
just
correct.
a vacant building in general?
I'm sorry, unabated vacant buildings, I'll say this in the process of, say, being sold by the owners.
Okay. I don't have an exact number. I would say in relation to how this bill is set up, few, if any at all, would come through to the legal section for us to file. So where the property has been rehabilitated and sold to somebody, but that seller did not abate the vacant building notice, our office, we're not usually looking to take those people to court. We contact the owners, we explain to them what has happened, why they've gotten this vacant building notice, why the property's under the code still considered a vacant building, what's needed, and then we tried to work with them to get the permits necessary and the inspections necessary in order to abate that notice without having to take them to court.
As an estimate, what does few look like? Is that like 5 cases annually? Is it 10, or is it?
I don't think there's any that fit that scenario, but I don't want to be that definitive. So it's possible that we may take somebody to court in that scenario, but it would be extremely rare. And it would be a situation where we've tried to work with them and they refuse to. Now, vacant buildings themselves that we take to court, we're taking between 450 and 550 to court right now. Generally, I'd say 99% of those are filed as receivership actions, but those aren't rehabbed buildings. Those are buildings that are vacant.
I appreciate you. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Block? Councilman Dorsey?
Sure, I'll ask something. Having been a person who has worked construction jobs and pulled permits myself, and worked closely with other people who have been doing this for a long time, the inspectors kind of like having their own idea of how things work. It seems a persistent problem, and I just sent an email today. I always seem to be in here on hearings about this kind of subject on days like right when I've gotten something that's pertinent to it. But like when an inspector, I feel like a lot of what we are talking about here and deal with is people who don't ordinarily engage in the permitting system, having a difficult time navigating it. But then we also have like a lot of people who engage in the permitting system like all the time and are not, they're not spring chicks. They know how the system works, and often they're not wrong about what they're experiencing, and they're just going, I can't believe that this inspector is telling me this thing that's just totally not right. And like right now we're dealing with a restaurant that is the 3rd iteration of a restaurant in the same place, and we have a pending liquor license transfer, and there have been no substantive changes to the place, but in order to affect the liquor license transfer, they need a fire inspection and they need a health inspection, for which they need a UNO inspection, a certificate that in this case is nothing but a change of operator. There have been no construction changes. It's just a change of operator. And yet we have an inspector who has now canceled inspections, scheduled inspections twice, citing his reason that there hasn't been a electrical inspection or HVAC inspection or plumbing inspection or framing inspection for plumbing, framing, electrical, and HVAC work that has not occurred. And so he's just like kind of like writing his own playbook. And this is, the question here is really like, what is the average person supposed to do except for come to their city council person when they know that the inspector is just being a problem?
Okay, you started out in one area, kind of brought it around. So to answer that particular question, obviously they can bring it to the city council person who will bring it to my attention.
I don't like bringing things to your attention. I don't want to be the,
Yeah, so the inspectors all have supervisors, so they can contact the office, ask to speak with a supervisor to discuss that. What you brought up with the use permit is a bit different. So there are a set of uses in the code that do require on the change of an owner or on the change of an operator for there to be a new use permit. And those don't apply to residential dwellings. Those are all commercial, and particularly commercials that have a lot of interaction with the public and with the city, and where it helps to have on record who's using the property, how to, who's responsible for it, how to reach them. Some of this is in our city code, some of it just mirrors other state codes. So with the transfer of a liquor license, you need to have a new use permit that has that liquor license holder on the use permit. And so even before our code said a restaurant needed to have a new use permit on a change of ownership, restaurant owners, that whenever there was a change of a new operator or whatever, they were coming in and applying anyway because they had to for their liquor license. So there is now a set of requirements, certain uses that at the change of a use, you have to, change of ownership, change of operator, you have to get a new use permit. In situations where that building inspector is looking in, they'll generally only cancel an inspection if they see that there is a prior notice on the property that did not get inspected, and so there's an open inspection, or fire hasn't gone out yet, or health hasn't gone out yet. So the building inspector is the last one going out. They are the ones making sure the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed so that that permit can be issued. And so it may not be that this new operator has done any work, but they may have bought the property from somebody who hired an electrician to come in and put a new hood up or put in new lighting, and they never called for their final inspection. And even though it was 5 years ago, we're now looking into it and saying, wait, nobody ever inspected this work. We need to get this work inspected.
All right, so
Those are two different issues from like kind of what your question was to
yeah,
what was discussed. I
just so to
understand that.
kind of refine my concern about both of these things is like, to be clear, this is a place that was open with a use and occupancy permit under a different operator 9 months ago, and nothing has changed except for operator. They had all the permits and they had the UNO because they had a liquor license, and it was they're just looking to be able to transfer it. How is it that an inspector gets it in their head that they have to get an inspection for trade work that hasn't occurred?
I'll have to.
Yeah, and insists that they can't perform their job unless something that doesn't need to happen happens.
Yeah, so I will have to look into the specifics of your situation, but in the times that I'm aware of that happening would be because the inspector's looking in the system and they see that a permit was pulled for that work but never inspected, or they've gone out to the property on some other inspection or something and seen something that should have had a permit and didn't. And, electrical work, plumbing work, a lot of that work has materials, and those materials are dated. And so you can tell when, not just looking new, but also that it has a manufactured stamp that, it definitely is new. It hasn't been there for 10 years or 5 years or whatever. So those are the two occasions. Like, I have to look into the specifics here to see what's fitting in, but I'm not aware of a situation where an inspector just out of the blue would say, you need a permit for lights that I've never seen, I've never looked at, and I have no reason to know that are there or not there.
Okay, and you said that the building inspector is the last person in.
Last inspector.
Last inspector. So in order to get a new UNO for a new occupant or operator of a commercial entity like this, they have to get the fire inspection and the health inspection before they can get the UNO?
Depending on what the use is. So,
It's for a restaurant.
yeah, so for a restaurant, they could call in for health and they could call in for fire, and those could go down parallel tracks.
Okay.
Doesn't matter who's first.
What leeway is there for somebody to say, I'm not coming until these other things happen? Because this is a routine thing. This is a routine thing where somebody says, I'm not going to come and do your inspection until this other entity has done their inspection. What room is there for somebody to claim that they have that right to say, I'm not going to inspect until?
The building inspector needs to sign off on the permit, and so they don't make that sign off until those other inspections have occurred.
Okay.
So there's no need for them to go out to the property until those other inspections have occurred.
Okay.
And it's passed, because what you may have in some situations is that they fail the fire inspection, and the fire inspector is requiring them to do 2 or 3 other things. And so now we'd have to go back out again after. So building is the last inspection, and they do. I used to sit 10 feet away from where they made their calls in the morning, and I would hear those cancellations, and I would listen in and try to figure out what was going on. But it's always where they've done their research on the property, and they've explained, hey, like, you don't have this sign off, you don't have that sign off. In the message board, when we tell the person, all right, you're ready for your inspections, that message is in there. Like, you need to call fire and schedule it, here's the numbers. You need to call health and schedule it, here's the numbers. You know, the building inspection is the final inspection, call those after the others.
All right, great. Thank you.
Colleagues? Councilwoman Ramos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on the conversation you were having with my colleague about the technology, I thought that, and maybe I just missed it, I thought that the department was looking at this Slate technology to be able to do the permit work, or is that something, that's totally different on the others, on the
That's the development division.
development side? Oh, okay. Because I know that the commissioner had talked about that a lot, and I wasn't quite sure if the two would,
That,
it would be doing all of the, no.
no, yeah, that's just for the sale of properties and advertising of properties and tracking those cases from the condemnation, eminent domain, in rem stuff.
Okay, and then we had said that, the commissioner had said that the reforms to the permit would be in place close to January, and we were going to schedule another hearing for that. Is that still on task?
I hope so. Like,
Yeah.
like, it's a big job. We've been talking with kind of, again, a parallel track of like talking with all the users and kind of getting that scope of work and what we need to have in there, and also looking at what's out there on the market, what other jurisdictions are using, you know, what the companies have to offer to try and match up as best, and then get something under contract. Once we have something under contract, there is a build-out period. Even though it's kind of an off-the-shelf product, it still needs to match up with all the things that, like I mentioned earlier, like
Henry's a genius. He'll figure it out.
yeah, well, Henry's not even that involved in this part, but he will be with like the mapping of it, but I mean, there's a lot of pieces as far as you got to get right in the beginning, or else you're going to have a headache when you launch. Baltimore City's pretty complicated. Like, you've got urban renewal plans, you've got zoning, you've got floodplain issues, you've got agricultural issues. Like, it's not just an urban center and that's it. Like, we've got everything that the rest of the state has and then some, and we all kind of live on top of each other at the same time. And so it's important for us to get this right. It's important to have a system that is easy for our customers to use, whether that customer is an experienced contractor or tradesperson, or it's just, Joe homeowner or that is trying to do a home improvement project and doesn't want to hire a contractor, and the job doesn't require a contractor, and so he should be able to do it himself, but he wants to do it right and get a permit. And so we're definitely taking the time to try and make sure we've got the right scope, that we've talked to all the right people. My ideal system in the end will be something where the need to call our department or email our department or reach out to the council person is dramatically decreased because you get on it and it's just as easy as, buying a new backpack on Amazon. Like, filter out your colors, filter out your size, and really we're only dealing with, when you get shipped something that doesn't fit and now you're returning it, kind of like scenario. That's the idea. And so we're trying to get it right, and I think our goal is January, but we got to get into it, and I've done enough of this to know that sometimes there's unforeseen problems, when we're dealing with making sure to match up with a fiscal payment system, making sure to match up with DPW's system.
What I don't want to hear, and I think my colleagues would agree, is that it's stuck in procurement.
Neither do I.
And so we need to head that off at the pass. So please
Been having those
keep us
discussions.
involved in that process, because I think all of us will flip out. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman, I just wanted to add, I think she was referring to next year, because if you look back at our timeline that was included in our last bill report on the permitting system, it lays out what we've already been doing and what our objective is for a launch in February of '24.
Right, she had said she'd be able to report back to us in January for the launch. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Colleagues, any other questions? Is there a motion to move the bill favorably?
If there's public testimony?
Oh, pardon me. Ms. Namdi? Ms. Namdi?
Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Hear you. Go ahead.
You can? Good morning. I just wanted to count, again, this is Lisa Mandy, creator, Fight Right, Be More, co-creator of the Sacrifice of Caesar Fund. And I really want the council to focus its energy in this regard on those folks who, like several of our clients, who purchase homes with the understanding that the house was livable and ready to go, and have now found out that there was no use in occupancy permit, and that there's a vacant building notice still sitting on the houses. There definitely should be some program within DCHD or some other relevant office to work people through those, help people work through those problems very specifically and explicitly, because folks, as someone mentioned, folks bought these houses not because they wanted to become rehabbers, but because they wanted to become homeowners. And so it is a very difficult process. And also sometimes folks ignore the vacant building notices that they receive post purchasing a home because they just think it's the city messing up. So one, there really needs to be an effort to clamp down on this even happening to anyone. But secondly, when this becomes a thing, the city should be really, housing in particular, should be developing programming to walk people through the process of getting these occupancy permits, so that it's clear, so that it's simple, and so that the burden doesn't fall on people who were not aware that this, that was the condition of the property when they purchased it. And so there's all those people who purchased before the law was passed last year. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a motion to move the bill favorably?
So moved.
Motion by Burnett. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Middleton. Costello, yes. Burnett?
Yes.
Dorsey?
Yes.
McCray?
Yes.
Middleton?
Yes.
Schleifer's absent. Stokes?
Yes.
This bill passes with 6 yeses and 1 absence. Moves to second reader at the next meeting of the City Council. We're now in recess.